Good morning again, all. Thank you again for those of you that have just joined for joining this morning's call. Very much appreciated. My name is Chris Chandler. I'm one of the pre-sales consultants here at Nexus Open Systems, and I'll be your compere this morning in advance of handing over to Barry. If again somebody could just confirm in the chat that you can indeed hear me. Great stuff. Thank you. Thank you for that, Nathan. So in advance of it's Barry, I think it would be somewhat remiss of me not to provide the members of the call that don't necessarily know who Nexus are, what we can provide. Just a very brief overview on our Skype for Business capabilities. So with regards to unified communications, we do offer the industry standard in unified communications, which is Skype for Business, or Link as it's historically known. Our investment and expertise in Skype for Business has made Nexus one of the leading deployment partners for that product, positioning ourselves to not only to deliver Skype for Business and enterprise voice capability, but also deliver the complementary infrastructure, including the likes of gateways, contact centers, and SIP trunk services. We've recently released a UC assurance support offering, which also now provides us with the ability to support customers in a truly proactive and responsive support methodology, and that's via a dedicated support help desk team. So really, the message there is what Nexus are trying to achieve is to really set ourselves apart from other partners in the Skype for Business deployment space. On that note, that is, as I said, a very brief overview because I appreciate that we've scheduled in only 30 minutes for the call this morning. So it's at this point that I would like to hand over to Barry to deliver the meat of today's seminar. I'll be on at the end to assist with the Q&A. Thanks again.
Good morning. As Chris has already detailed, my name is Barry. I'm a technical consultant at Nexus Open Systems, and my primary role within the organization is the deployment and implementation of Link Server and Skype for Business solutions. So over the next 20 minutes, I'll be taking you through options that you have to migrate your current PBX to a Skype for Business solution. It's worth saying at this point, with the exception of one of the architectures that I'm going to show you, the majority of them are focused more towards completely moving away from your PBX and transitioning to a Skype for Business solution. So there's only one of the architectures that I'll show you a little bit later that will enable you to essentially reutilize existing handsets. But as we go through, you'll see the pros and cons of each approach. As Chris mentioned before he started speaking, if someone could just possibly tap a message in the chat just to make sure you can hear me before I start, then that would be great. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Right. So agenda for this morning. It's going to be available approaches to migrating your existing PBX to Skype for Business. So we're going to go through a series of those. It is assumed at the start of this webinar that you have an idea of what Skype for Business and Link is. And this is really an architecture overview of how we can join your existing PBX into a Skype for Business solution for the purposes of, as I mentioned before, migrating to that platform on a permanent basis. We'll then move through and look through the advantages and disadvantages of all the approaches that I'm going to talk about. They're cutover migrations, phased, direct SIP, and call via work. And then finally at the end, if you have any questions around the architectures that I've detailed, then of course we can take some questions. So moving on to the first option, it's a phase migration. This is the most common that we deploy and that customers generally request. So in a phase migration, this is where we use a third-party piece of equipment called a session border controller, and we partner with audio codes for the delivery of that. We place that in between the legacy PBX and the Skype for Business platform, and that gives us very tight integration between the two. Now, the benefit of using a phase migration is that the call routing technologies that we have as a part of that are extremely flexible. So I'm just going to annotate the slide here and the diagram on the right, just before I move through the bullet points. But in all your environments at the moment, and for simplicity, we'll say that you have a single inbound ISDN 30. At present, that will be connected to the legacy PBX down here. Now, what we do in order to leverage that ISDN on the Skype for Business platform and also enable calling between those two platforms, we integrate a session border controller, which is the device just at the top here, into your environment during an out of hours period. So we disconnect the ISDN from the existing PBX, we place it into our session border controller, and then using a specific crossover cable, which is a PRI crossover cable, we then connect that to your legacy PBX. And by connecting that crossover to the PBX, we're essentially fooling it into thinking that it's connected to, say, BT or Virgin. So by doing that, when we get an inbound call comes in from the PSTN, and it's going to hit our SBC there. Now, a key call routing technology we have as a part of the SBC is doing an Active Directory lookup. So when an inbound call comes into a user's DDI, the gateway on the fly will do a lookup to Active Directory and see whether the inbound DDI that's associated with a user, whether they're enabled for Skype for Business. If they are enabled for Skype for Business, instead of passing the call into the legacy PBX below in this diagram, it forks a call off to the right onto the Skype for Business server, therefore calling the user at the phone at the bottom. That can be turned on and off at will, so it's very easy to transition a person away from the legacy PBX onto the Skype for Business platform literally within a click. It also provides you with the flexibility of moving back to the legacy phone system. So say, for example, you've moved a user over and they've had some issues, perhaps with training, haven't quite got the concept of Skype for Business or the soft client. Well, if you want to move them back, we disable them for voice in Skype for Business. And in that particular scenario, when the inbound call comes into the SBC at the top here, the Active Directory lookup fails because the user's not enabled for Skype for Business, and it sends the call down into the legacy PBX and then rings their handset. So that's a really easy way for us to slowly, and a more risk-averse way for us to transition customers to a Skype for Business solution. It may also fit in with training paths. So for example, you could train a department at a time and then transition them over using the method that I just detailed. Or for example, it can well fit into handset budgets. If you're an organization that wishes to retain handsets, well, then you could buy them on a departmental basis rather than buying them all at one time. Now, the second thing that this approach also provides is, as well as the inbound call routing that I detailed, it also allows you to call in between the two systems. So in this case, when a call comes from the Skype for Business server on the right here, if, for example, we'll say Chris is on the legacy phone system and I'm on the Skype for Business platform, I dial Chris's extension. It doesn't match in Skype for Business because Chris isn't enabled. In that case, the server then sends it to the SBC on the right here. We then have a set of routing rules within the session border controller that say any call that's going to Chris's extension, don't send out to BT or Virgin, our ISDN carrier. We want to then send that down to the legacy PBX to phone Chris's extension. So that's how we call from Skype for Business to legacy PBX. And that can be any system, whether it's using ISDN 30, ISDN 2E, so PRI, BRI, or even SIP. And the age of that phone system in this particular scenario doesn't matter because we're using a common ISDN standard to communicate between the two. Likewise, calling from the legacy PBX to Skype for Business, we'll say that I was on the legacy PBX at one point and my extension was 1234. I've moved over on Skype for Business. So Chris then places a call, who's down here, to 1234, and what we need to do to get that call over onto the new platform is to place a diver on my extension. So for example, my divert would be 9 and then followed by my number. When Chris calls that, the 9 tells the legacy PBX to send the call to the outside world because 9 is a prefix that we dial to call outside. That forces a call up to the SBC. There's a rule on there looking for 1234, which is my extension. And then in the same method as previously, we say don't send to the PSTN. We say send that into Skype for Business and call my handset. And that's how we can achieve true interoperability between the two systems. And that is the most popular approach to migrating to a platform in a phase, as I said, more risk-averse way. I've obviously talked about a lot of the pros of this approach. The disadvantage of this approach is that from a cost perspective, the session border controller, it does need to have two ports of ISDN or PRI in it. One for the inbound connection, and one that goes into the legacy PBX. So you're doubling the ports that you need to have to be able to achieve this solution. However, a customer put to me recently that it's much in the same way as when this particular customer migrated from a Novell to a Windows Active Directory platform. They bought a set of Quest tools to enable them to get from point A to point B. And that's essentially what you're doing here. You're buying an extra port of PRI, irrespective of whether you need it when the deployment's over, but it's allowing you to get from point A to point B. So as I said, that's the most popular migration path that we have. Moving on to the next potential method is what we call a cutover migration. Now this is particularly targeted perhaps towards smaller organizations, small to medium business. And when I say cutover migration, that is essentially setting up the system side by side. The Skype for Business platform at deployment has no access to the PSTN, and the only way that we can provide that is simply taking the ISDN connection out of the existing phone system and connecting it into our session border controller at the top here. So that's from a cost perspective a little bit more cost effective because we're not having to buy that second port of PRI. However, as I put in the bullet points at the top there, it's restricting our testing to out of hours only. So obviously we're not going to want to disconnect the ISDN during the middle of the day. And the other thing that it also does from a kind of a risk perspective is when you do that cutover migration, you're transitioning all users at one time. So you have to make sure that first of all, if you're going to do that, you've got your capital expenditure outlay on handsets, consultancy, all those kind of things that you can kind of stagger in the previous method that I showed. But also from a logistical point of view, you're cutting over a large amount of users in one go. So for those of you who are on the call, are kind of 500 users plus, you get into kind of a logistical point of view where if you have an office, a head office, for example, of that size, this particular strategy does introduce a lot of risk. If you're a smaller customer, you kind of maybe 10 to 50 or even 150 users, that's something that can be logistically dealt with on a go live day by having trained staff available to help users. Anything above that, it's particularly more risky. For those of you that would like to implement a Skype for Business or Link solution in a greenfield site, the diagram on the right here is essentially what we would place. A session border controller, and you need one of those because that's the way that essentially Skype for Business and Link gain access to the PSTN. A session border controller is something that we definitely recommend because it gives us much more flexibility over how we handle and route calls. Even though you can terminate SIP trunks directly into Skype for Business and Link, that's not something that we or is widely kind of acknowledged in the industry as being a best practice. So again, if you were a greenfield site, the architecture that you have on the right there is something that you'd be looking to go towards. Side-by-side migration. This is very similar to the phase migration in some ways. However, in some scenarios, where on the first slide that I showed you, we can interconnect Skype for Business and the PBX together. In some environments, that perhaps isn't possible. Maybe because it's the ISDN protocol that's being used. So no qualified link gateways support the DAS2 protocol. Certainly not on an audio codes and Sona's point of view. In one particular scenario, the legacy PBX that we're replacing for a customer, they don't have any access to, and we don't have access to because it's a completely managed service. So getting that tight integration is a little bit difficult. So in a side-by-side migration, and this is only really applicable if you're looking at running in a new form of connectivity, we can still achieve interoperability, but there is a slight disadvantage that I'll explain in a second. So in this particular scenario, we've deployed Skype for Business on the left here, we've implemented an SBC, and for example purposes, this particular customer decided that we're going to transition to SIP. So they've had a SIP trunk terminated on the SBC on the left there, they've got a set of temporary numbers, and that's all working great. In order to gain interoperability between the two, what we can essentially do is call forward between these two platforms. So in the example that I gave you earlier where I'd moved to Skype for Business and Chris was still on the legacy PBX, and in that case, I'd forwarded my old PBX extension to 91234, and that was internally routed. In this side-by-side migration strategy, that call is actually going out to the PSTN. So it comes up to this point here, and the divert that we've actually put on the phone would be a 9 followed by a temporary DDI that I've got on the SIP trunk. And by diverting to there, it then comes into the SBC and it then goes down to Skype for Business. Now, while that provides a very similar kind of interoperability to the first example that I gave, it does mean that what are classed as internal calls are essentially being performed at a local call rate. So there is a cost impact to doing that. We have done this at several customers for the reason that I gave before. Again, it does offer you interoperability, but it is at a cost. It does reduce risk. It's not like the cutover migration. Again, you could divert certain extensions for certain departments at particular times, and the systems do run in parallel. It is, however, a more complex than the first migration strategy because you're having to do a lot of number management. So people on the Skype for Business solution will have temporary DDIs in the SIP trunk. You're doing a lot of number forwarding. So from an IT perspective, and those of you that work in IT departments, there's a little bit more management essentially required. But I would say this is a reasonably popular approach for the reasons that I've just detailed. The next method is direct SIP, and this is often something that's on the face of it very attractive for customers. And this is where if you have a PBX that does have SIP capability, you can sit Skype for Business behind that PBX and then use that PBX as a way for Skype for Business to reach the outside world. So in the diagram we've got here, on your existing PBX, you would need to have SIP channel licensing, and we would create a SIP trunk between the two platforms. And when the Skype for Business user down here on the right-hand side dials out, it hits the platform in front. It's then sent down the SIP trunk to our legacy PBX, and the legacy PBX is then configured to send those calls out to the PSTN. Likewise, inbound, an inbound call comes in to the user's DDI. The call is then collected by the PBX, and it's essentially diverted down the established SIP trunk to the Skype for Business platform. That's predominantly done by having like a short code on the PBX that will send a call down a particular route. Now, from a supportability point of view, there are only certain PBXs that are supported from Microsoft's point of view for you to use in this scenario. And the reason being is in a lot of cases that while SIP is an open standard, different companies' interpretations of SIP is slightly different. And for those of you that will go away after this webinar and have a look at the interoperability guidelines for direct SIP, you will notice that in a lot of cases there are limitations, particularly around call forwarding, placing calls on hold, support for functionality or refer packets often isn't available. In addition, when customers speak to ourselves and they go and speak to their existing PBX manufacturer, they'll often find that they perhaps need a firmware upgrade to support this feature, which in turn can incur a cost, and often providing or procuring rather SIP channel licensing from an existing vendor and the consultancy that you would need from their point of view to do that configuration on the PBX, the cost of that can significantly outweigh the benefits of this approach. And ultimately, if you were going to take this approach on board and you wanted to phase away that PBX for a Skype for Business solution, at some point you're going to have to decommission this PBX, and you're also going to have to buy a session border controller to terminate your SIP connectivity or your ISDN connectivity, which again is going to incur downtime. So yes, this might be a good option perhaps for a pilot, but from our point of view, if we were going to look to kind of permanently move to a Skype for Business solution, this isn't something that we would necessarily recommend. If you're already on a firmware that supports Link and Skype for Business and you've already got SIP channel licensing on your PBX, then yes, it's perhaps an option, but you'll need to bear in mind that there are limitations around certain scenarios. So that's direct SIP. Just to clarify as well, in the three examples that I've given previous to this, they don't provide any capabilities for you to use existing handsets that you have on your desk. This is all transition methods to go directly over to Skype for Business exclusively. The next feature, it's new in Skype for Business. It's actually a reworking of a technology that came out in Link Server 2010, and it's called Call via Work. It's, as I say, it's new to Skype for Business. It's kind of in its early days. I've put this in here as a slide. It's not something that we're recommending that customers use at the moment, but it is something you're going to see Microsoft push. I think it was just something that needed to be addressed in here as an option that you do potentially have. So with Call via Work, essentially a SIP trunk is created between either Skype for Business, which is just here, and the legacy PBX, or you could have a session border controller sat in front. And this is a way, or a functionality rather, that you can use to retain your existing handset and leverage Skype for Business. So for example, in the diagram that we have here, on users A desktop at the bottom, they would initiate a call from their Skype for Business client. That would go up to the Skype for Business server and then be sent down a SIP trunk into the legacy PBX. That would then be instructed to call the number that the user had entered into their client. Perhaps, for example, it would be Nexus's phone number. The Skype for Business server then also sends a secondary command to ring the user's PBX handset. Now that sounds quite strange because you're making an outbound call, and why would your handset ring? However, when that ringing handset is answered, Skype for Business bridges the outbound call that the PBX has made to Nexus and bridges the inbound call that it's made to the user's PBX handset. And that then creates the conversation. However, once that's been established and answered on the user's handset, there are a list of limitations to what you can do in the Skype for Business client. So while you've initiated the call from that perspective, you've picked up your legacy PBX handset, you're in the conversation. What you can't do, however, from the Skype for Business client is you can't hold calls from the client, you can't transfer, you can't do call park, and you can't call forward to any voicemail system that may reside on the legacy PBX. Additionally, when this configuration is applied to a particular user, you can't make that user or that handset a member of a hunt group, or as Microsoft call them, response groups. So there are significant telephony features that are disabled by going down the Call via Work route. Again, it may be good for a pilot, but as in the direct SIP method, there's going to be only a list of supported PBXs to create this SIP trunk piece that I highlighted in the center there. Again, you could have a session border controller above all of this architecture that accepts a chord and sends it down to the PBX if you can't establish a SIP trunk between the two. But again, if you're going to buy a session border controller, then as detailed in the previous slides, there's much more efficient ways to kind of get to a point where you've got some sort of coexistence. In addition to the limitations around this particular feature, the configuration of that is predominantly PowerShell based. So it's for larger organizations on this call that have role-based IT departments. For those of you that are aware of Skype for Business and Link, you can manage a lot through what's called the control panel. This configuration cannot be done through there. It requires direct access to the server to be able to execute a set of PowerShell commands through the Skype for Business management shell. So as I say, I've detailed this technology. Right now, I don't think it's something that necessarily would work for the majority of you. That may well change in the future. But this is also a technology, for those of you that are familiar with Link, that is going to supersede what was known as remote call control. And that was a feature that allowed Link to integrate tightly with an existing legacy PBX handset, using a product that sat in the middle by that particular vendor. So in the Mitel world, for those of you that run Mitel phone systems, you could get Link and Mitel to talk quite tightly by deploying what's called a Mitel Live Business Gateway. And that means when a call comes in via Link, the Mitel handset rings, and you get a lot more control to the client. That's now been depreciated in Skype for Business. The functionality is still there, and you can use that functionality only if you're using the Link client on the desktop. If you run the Skype for Business client on the user's desktop, the remote call control functionality is not available. So I'm hoping that this technology will improve in the future. Again, I've just detailed it to make you aware, but I don't think it's something that at present is a specifically viable option for a lot of customers. So we've reviewed all of the architectures and migration methods that we have available to transition. I appreciate in a lot of things that you might have seen about Skype for Business and Link that this perhaps isn't detailed and how we kind of get from point A to B. So hopefully that's answers some questions for you. However, we're at the stage now where we can take questions and answers. So Chris is going to allow you to do that through the chat or a Q&A. So we've got a Q&A there, so if you want to pop your question in, I'll answer them predominantly over audio, so that they're in the webinar recording. And then any additional ones that are asked while I'm speaking, I'm sure Chris will be able to pick up. Yeah, the question from Goodridge there. Yes, that is straightforward. So there's a few options that you have for satellite offices. WAN connectivity is definitely a consideration that needs to be made. The call quality of linking compared to a lot of other PBX is significantly higher. But you could feasibly install a Skype Business solution in your headquarters, and then have users on clients in satellite sites connect back into there to enable inter-site calling. If the WAN links are good, if the WAN links are slightly poor, or perhaps you have an office maybe in North America or in Asia, then I would definitely recommend having architecture in those locations, specifically to overcome latency around call transfers or hitting response groups or hunt groups, just to kind of minimize the amount of traffic that's gone over the WAN. But we do have a proportion of clients that have good WAN connections to sites throughout the UK and Europe, and they have a centralized link server deployment sat in data centers, and it works very well.